Two facts from HDB, but both seem to contradict each other. On one hand, HDB resale prices fell. The HDB Price Index slipped to 202.7, down 0.3% in Q2 after a decline in 0.1% in Q1. First back-to-back decline in nearly 7 years. And for the first time in years, the index is now down year on year too. And number two, on the other hand, records just keep breaking anyway. A 3-room flat in Bidadari went for $945,000. A 2-room at Queenstown went for $696,000, a national record for its flat types. And in Q2 alone, 491 flats sold above $1 million, the higher quarterly count ever, putting the first half of 2026 at 902 against 763 for the same of the first half last year. So which is it? Is it cooling or is it record-breaking? They are not in conflict, they are the same story from two ends. The HDB market has stopped moving as one entity. It's actually splitting in two, and that is the K-curve. And which side your flat sits on has very little to do with how nicely your unit may be renovated or how nice the views may be. And if you were here in January, you recognize this. In my 2026 overview, I said that BTO and MOP supply wave would land hardest on the older flats. That was a forecast then, and this is the first hard proof. Though I'll correct one thing from back then, I framed it as the entire HDB resale market cooling as one thing, but it isn't exactly. It is actually cooling unevenly, and that unevenness is the whole story today. So consider this the receipts plus the updates and hit follow if you want the rest, because this split is going to run for the next decade. First, what that 0.3% actually is, because most people read it wrong. The resale price index isn't the average price of flats sold. If it were, then the quarter staff with all these records would have pushed it up. The index ignores which flats happen to sell. It actually asks a more specific question. Same kind of flat, same size, same age, same sort of location, but what did it cost this quarter versus the last? So picture a tug of war. On one end, you have the young, well-located flats breaking records and climbing in prices, pulling their side up. And on the other end, you have the aging heartland stocks slowly losing momentum and demand, pulling their side down. This index is simply where the flag ends up with. And in this quarter, the flag moved down 0.3%. The top put with everything it had, more $1 million flats in history, and the rope still slid backwards anyway. And this only happens when the other side is heavier. And it is, even at a record quarterly high. $1 million flats were 7.9% of transactions in Q2 2026. The middle and the bottom is the other 92% of the transactions. But this is the uncomfortable truth. If the record setters were lifting all of the quarter and the number still came out negative, the other end isn't just falling 0.3%. It's possibly falling by even more than that. That 0.3% isn't the bad news, it is actually the candy-coated version of it. Which means that today the question isn't whether the market is up or down, it's more of which end of this rope that your flat is on. The easiest explanation for all the record breaking is because they had the longest lease. But the argument alone isn't true for the record breaking units. We have been building BTOs for decades and everyone started at 99 years. There are recently MOP units all around Singapore this year, but nobody is paying $1 million for them all. In this market, a long lease isn't special but just the default expectations of buyers that are coming in. Look at where the record setters are instead. The 945,000 Bidadari 3-room or the 696,000 2-room at Dawson, and the highest price that any HDB flat has ever transacted, 1.728 million for a 5-room champion at Henderson. 40 over stories above. Bidadari, Queenstown, Henderson, Dawson Road. These are not the usual places that HDB used to build new flats. For most of our history, if you wanted a new flat, you would go to where the vacant land was, which was the outskirts. Central land usually only had old HDB sitting on it. There was only one exception back then, and you know its name. It was Pinnacle at Duxton, the only BTO ever built in the city itself. After it cleared MOP in 2014, it printed multi-million-dollar sales and basically became the showcase HDB estate of Singapore. Even my first ever $1 million flat transaction was in Pinnacle in 2021. And while Pinnacle today is still setting its own records, 1.63 million this May, but it's no longer the record. And over the years, it stopped being alone. Over the last decade, HDB started building brand new flats in mature central expensive locations. Bidadari as a new township in empty prime land at the edge of Toa Payoh, the whole Sky series rebuilding the heart of Queenstown, and even Henderson just beside Tiong Bahru. That whole cohort has been rolling through its 5-year MOP since around 2020. And that's the real trade of the top part of this K-curve. Not just long lease, but a brand new flat somewhere that used to only have expensive private property and aging HDB flats. The lease is the entry ticket into the market, and the location is what sets the record. Which is why these buyers are not crazy, because in those locations, the alternative is a condo at 2 or 3 times the price. Standing in Queenstown, a $696,000 flat isn't an expensive option. It is actually the more affordable one when you compare it to similar sized private properties. And here's how recent all of this is. Back in October 2020, then National Minister for Defense Desmond Lee told Parliament that $1 million flats were a small minority, 38 out of more than 14,400 resale transactions in the first 8 months of that year. That's 0.26%, nothing to worry about. However, fast forward to today, this quarter alone, 7.9% of transactions were $1 million flats, a 30-fold shift in just 6 years. But as we go down the line to $1 million flats, there is one complication, because the data doesn't line up perfectly. 6 towns actually set new record prices in this quarter, and 2 of the 6 weren't new flats at all. One was a 1988 executive flat at Toei Gardens in Bukit Timah at 1.51 million, and another is a 1995 executive flats in Tampines, Arcadia at 1.24 million. Both were around 150 square meters. So the trade of record-breaking isn't strictly just newness or location, it is also scarcity. HDB stopped building huge executive flats decades ago, which means that 150 square meters is something that the government cannot supply again. And the market pays for that the same way it pays for a new flat in prime location. 2 different routes, but still the same destination. And now imagine what you would do with a prime flat with brand new lease with a unique selling point like a loft unit. And then you understand why Dawson units were going for so much. Now the ironic part of why this K-curve would continue going up. And it's actually the government's doing. The restrictions started earlier than most people realize. In October 2021, the government announced the PLH, or Prime Location Public Housing Model, and applied it from November 2021 BTO exercise onwards. Any new flat in a prime location from that point came with a 10-year MOP instead of 5. A subsidy clawback on the resale transaction, BTO eligibility criteria including an income ceiling on whoever buys it from you in the resale market, and a permanent ban on renting out the whole flat. In October 2024, Standard, Plus and Prime placed the old, mature and non-mature classification and extended a lighter version of those restrictions to the entire Plus tier. And take note that none of these restrictions were applied to launches from the past. Every record setter in the news today was launched before any of these new restrictions. 5-year MOP, no clawback, no income ceiling for your next buyer. And you can see both were sitting side by side at Henderson. City View at Henderson, launched under the old rules, was the one that just set the national record at 1.728 million, and it can be sold to anyone. But practically just next door, Bukit Merah reached launch in May 2022 under PLH. 1,669 units that won't clear MOP until the late 2030s. And even then, they can only sell to a buyer under the income ceiling with a clawback taken off the top. Households with a higher than 14,000 income ceiling won't qualify for those new PLH flats in the resale market in the future, and may very well turn to places like City View at Henderson, pushing their prices further up. So this isn't just a pioneer cohort of new record-breaking flats. It is a close and limited set. A fixed number of new flats in prime locations carrying unrestricted resale rights with no replacements for them in roughly a decade. The last batch of pre-PLH launches like Bishan Regis would finish their MOP around 2030, and after that there is nothing else behind them until the first PLH flats free up near 2038, which is exactly why this won't be the last time you see these estates on the news breaking records. So the biggest question is, who is actually buying these units? Here's a quick timeline on how million-dollar flats grew over the years. 82 in the whole of 2020, 470 by 2023, then it breaks 1035 in 2024, 1594 in 2025, and over 900 in the first half of this year alone. Now put a second chart beside it, released on the same day as this HDB Q2 flash report, the General Household Survey. Households earning at least 30,000 a month nearly doubled in the last 5 years, 7.4% to 13.4%, roughly 1 in 7 households. And household income above $12,000 went from 38.2% to 51.6%. And the median household income crossed $12,000 for the first time ever, as we've seen in the Budget 2026. The pool that can actually afford a million-dollar flat comfortably has roughly doubled. The top of the K-curve isn't a crazy bubble, but the choice of the wealthier households that chose to go with HDB instead of private properties in that locality. Which brings me to a twist that maybe some of these buyers perhaps don't realize themselves. Take the household that paid $945,000 for that 3-room Bidadari flat. Say they earn $14,000 a month, and with that exact income, they could have serviced a bigger loan on a private condo than on the flat that they bought. And here's why. Because any HDB purchase is capped by MSR at 30% of income. MSR loan calculations gets you a mortgage of approximately $4,200 a month, which is an equivalent of $795,000 on loan. A condo, on the other hand, uses TDSR, which takes into account all of your debt within 55% of your income. So that same income now allows $7,700 mortgage a month, supporting roughly a $1.6 million loan. Same paycheck, but 1.8 times the borrowing power. And if all of these seem like foreign terms to you, you can refer to this video where I break down all cooling measures and terminologies regarding real estate. But coming back to this case, which means that instead of getting this 3-room Bidadari resale flat, they could have gone for a similar size 2-bedroom Park Colonial unit instead. So the million-dollar flat buyers usually isn't stretching to their ceiling. They are actually buying below it, and perhaps maybe on purpose even, because whether it's the lower outlay upfront or the cheaper recurring mortgage or the holding costs and even the size difference in the units that they are looking at in the area. And now the mirror image, the aging 99-year stock, the 30, 40, 45-year-old flats that were, until recently, the default first home for a whole generation. And this isn't just a niche part of the market, it is the majority of Singapore. Roughly half of our HDB stock was built before 1990s, 580 flats already at or under 63 years of remaining lease. The record setters are the minority. The majority still form the base of the pyramid. And now whenever lease decay is mentioned, it's just some vague woo-woo term. But let me give you a tangible example of it. I'm 37 years old this year, and to be able to use my full CPF withdrawal limits for the house and take the maximum 75% loan, the remaining lease has to cover me to the age of 95. So I would need a house with at least 58 years lease left. And that points me to a flat whose lease started in 1985 or later, one of the oldest generation HDB flats. Fine, it's cheap, it's big, I like it, so I buy it. And now, say I upgrade in 5 to 10 years time, in 5 years, that flat now has 53 years lease left. So my buyer has to be likely at least 42 years old. And in 10 years down the road, when the lease is reduced down to 48 years, my buyer has to be 47 years old. I did nothing. Time just passed and the lease decayed, and it pushed back the youngest person who could comfortably afford my flat from 37 years old to 42 years old and to 47 years old. And now look closely at what I actually own. It is a 1985 5-room flat that enticed me because of its size. And who buys big flats? They are usually the growing families, the late 20s, the early 30s, the people who actually need the bedrooms and space. This age 95 rule has locked the exact group of people out of the market, and the only buyers allowed in are pushing 50 years old. And at that age, most families are already past the expansion phase. They are downsizing and not upsizing, and that is the structural mismatch. The flat type says young family, but the lease math says over 45 years old only. And even if an older buyer commits, they too will be squeezed on the financing as well. On a HDB loan, your maximum loan tenure is 65 minus your age. At 37 years old in my example, I will get the full 25 years loan, about 2,722 a month on a $600,000 loan. At 47 years old, my future buyer only gets 18 years of loan, 3,481 a month for the exact identical loan amount, nearly 28% more every month on the same flat. Smaller pool of buyers, older aged buyers, worse financing, wrong life stage, and all four gets worse every single year you hold on to your old flat. And unlike private property, there's no en-bloc waiting at the end to bail you out. The lease just runs to zero and the flat goes back to the state. And that's the true horror and reason why old flat prices are coming down. Supply is piling up with an aging population and more flat inheritance sales going on, while demand is dropping year by year based on lease decay. An estimated 13,480 flats would reach MOP in 2026, nearly double the number in 2025. And the pipeline gets heavier from here. But these numbers matter less than what those flats actually are. Picture what a 5-year-old MOP flat offers. It's move-in ready, no hacking required, no rewiring, no $80,000 renovation before you can actually sleep in it. It has around 93 years of lease left also, so CPF and financing are completely unrestricted. And here's what most people don't think about until it's too late. These freshly MOP BTO flats have a very clean exit. Sell it in 10 years time and it still has 83 years on its lease, which means that your buyer can be from any age, even from the age of 21. You are not going to be inheriting a shrinking buyer pool. And the trade-off for this lower rental costs, better built, almost 99-year lease option is just space. That's it. That's the entire trade-off. A newer 4-room and an older 5-room flat have almost identical layouts. A master bedroom, 2 common bedrooms, a common bath, a kitchen. Same number of bedrooms. The 5-room flats just have a bigger living and dining area. And the MOP wave isn't arriving alone. Stack the government's BTO program on top, roughly 55,000 units across 2025-2027, with the government signaling it wants to push even past that, which raises the question that plenty of buyers are asking now. Why should I be paying $650,000 for a 40-year-old flat when the government is selling a brand new one for $400,000? And of course, the counter argument is that plenty of people also can't take the BTO option at all. PR households are locked out entirely, anyone above the income ceiling is out, and anyone who needs immediate housing from their current place is also out. So yes, the resale market will never stop being relevant because there will always be a pool of buyers with no alternative to a BTO. But when newer MOP flats are competing with older HDB stock at similar price ranges, most of that resale pool would eventually turn towards the newer lease. And you as a buyer, if you're comparing between a newer 4-room flat versus an older 4-room flat because the older one looks like a discount for even more space, be very careful with the remaining lease, especially if you know that this is not going to be your final home. And like what I always tell my clients, we 37, 38 years old people are likely the very last generation to be able to buy any types of housing in the market without worrying about this decay. And now notice something about the scenarios we have just described. They are all shopping for better value within the same HDB market, comparing older HDBs to newer lease ones. And these are seldom the ones that are setting the records. They are probably keeping the price the same, if not dropping it a little more because it's an older lease flat. The top of the K-curve has a completely different reference point. They are weighing a high-price HDB against the private market in the same locality, And that is the exact reason why the two ends will move independently of each other. As long as private property prices keep climbing, the ceiling on what the top of the curve flat can fetch would continue climbing with them. And put that next to the plus and prime in the future resale, which locks out high earners of the newer prime HDB resale stock and continues funneling them into the existing unrestricted million-dollar clusters like Henderson, Bidadari, Queenstown, or even Ghim Moh. And add that into the mix and the top of the curve estates will continue climbing even more. And isn't it ironic that the new BTO supply that the government has came up with to stem resale prices is actually flooding the weak resale market of older flats? And the new plus and prime housing actually concentrates the wealthiest buyer into a fixed set of limited flats at the top. The two measures that will aim at cooling the market are actually prying the K-curve further apart. And now let me be clear about what this is and isn't, because I'm not here to sell you doom and gloom. This is definitely not a crash. Down 0.3%, then 0.1% before it. This is just a plateau, not an end of the world crashing of the market. Anyone calling it a collapse is overreading into the data. What I'm describing here, however, is the divergence of trajectories. The downside risk for older flats that we are talking about here is modeled after the mechanisms in the market and not something that is in the data. But let's also keep this in proportion. The top of the K-curve is a narrow band. Million-dollar flats were only 7.9% of transactions in Q2. And even generously defined, I would guess that this segment probably tops up somewhere around 15% of total HDB supply, possibly in the future. This isn't indicative of the whole market, it's just the part that is pulling away from the rest of the market. And for what it's worth, Propnex data still expects resale prices to finish 2026 up to 1% higher. And by the way, this same split is surfacing in the private property market. In Q2, Vela Bay transacted at nearly 2,900 PSF, while Canberra Crescent residences went at around 2,000 PSF. A 800 PSF price gap inside the same OCR region in the same quarter. That's the private market K-curve forming as well. And it also honestly deserves a video on its own. Subscribe if you want it when the video is out eventually. So three situations. If you own an aging flat, 30 plus years old, heartland, away from the MRT and nothing special about the flat, time isn't on your side. And the MOP wave isn't your friend. This isn't a panic sell, but if selling was ever on your horizon within the next 3 to 5 years, the case for selling sooner is stronger this quarter than it was the last. Every year you hold, your buyer pool shrinks and your young lease competition grows. And second scenario, if you are choosing between a young lease resale and an older flat, the young lease one costs more today, but you're buying clean financing and a seat at the top of the K-curve. The older one looks like a bargain, but you may be catching the bottom of the curve and you inherit its lease problem when you try to sell in the future. Cheaper is definitely not safer here. And scenario number 3, if you are sitting on a young lease flat in Bidadari, in Queenstown or Dawson or Henderson, congratulations, you are on the right side of this curve. But don't feel too safe yet because HDB changes its policies every few years. But as of now, you guys are the champion of the HDB supply. So HDB prices just isn't about falling or setting records. In fact, they are doing both because the market has stopped moving as one entity. A top of the curve new flat in places that never had new flats pulling away, and the bottom of the curve, which is the aging HDB flats, quietly sinking. So stop asking whether HDB prices are up or down. Start asking which part of this K-curve that your flat is on. That's the only question that matters and what trajectory you're putting your life plans on. Tell me in the comments which part of this curve your house is at. You can even put down the town, the rough lease age, and we can all weigh in to see where it sits at. And if you want your specific flat upgrade timeline to run against those numbers, your lease or your exit windows, drop me a DM at 96971000. My name is ASAP and I will see you in the next video.